The
Please
whole
don't get on
town
that train.
is hunting him to death.
I have to, Thomas.
But the
I
fat
just can't
mail
stay
order
anymore.
bride risked everything to save the mountain man.
I held them off for as long as I could.
$2,000 for his head.
You have to leave
Dead
me.
is cleaner. The sheriff's voice carried across Blackwater's main street like a whip crack, and the crowd leaned in to stare at the scarred poster nailed to the hitching rail. Tobias Crane, murder and rape, $2,000 reward. Mothers pulled their children closer, men checked the load on their colts. The town smelled of snowmelt and whiskey and the sweet rot of rumor. On the depot platform, a trunk thumped at Rosie Palmer's feet. The station master slapped a refund voucher into her palm as if it burned. "Your gentleman declined delivery," he said, loud enough for the knot of onlookers to hear. "Said the bride looked bigger in person. Contract void." Laughter licked through the crowd. "Send her to the livery. Maybe she can pull the wagon." "Should have sold her by the pound." Heat climbed Rosie's cheeks, but she stood very still. 21, soft-figured and travel-worn, she had learned the art of becoming smaller without moving an inch. Shoulders tucked, gaze on the boards. Breath held until the jeers passed like a bad wind. She had 3 coins and a patchwork carpet bag to her name. No ticket back. No home that wanted her. Somewhere between Boston and this muddy edge of Montana, a family had traded her future for winter coal, and a stranger she'd never met had returned her like spoiled goods. The sheriff rattled the poster again. "Crane was seen near Willow Pass. He's wounded, but a cornered wolf still bites. Volunteers at daybreak. We bring him in or we bring him down." "Bring him down!" someone shouted. "Hang him high!" Rosie's eyes flicked to the paper. A rough charcoal face glared back, bearded, broad-shouldered, eyes the flat color of winter sky. The lines of his jaw were cut by a hand that hated him. "Murderer!" the letters screamed. "Monster!" But monsters didn't carry the kind of grief etched into the sketch artist's crooked strokes. She saw it, the way you see a storm from a distance, there in the set of the mouth, the hollow where a smile should live. Perhaps she imagined it. Perhaps her own hunger made her tender to other kinds. The station master shooed her from the platform. "Go on now. Don't clog the way." Rosie drifted toward the alley where the street narrowed between the hotel and the assay office, blinking back humiliation. A freight wagon rattled past. Somewhere a piano banged out a jaunty tune no one believed. Snow began to fall in fine, stubborn pins. She heard him before she saw him. A stagger, a muffled curse, the wet cough of a man holding pain in his teeth. From the shadow of the alley, a figure lunged and braced a blood-slick shoulder against brick. He was impossibly large up close, taller than any man had a right to be, coat torn, one sleeve dark with drying black. His eyes found hers the way a drowning man finds air. "Don't scream," he said, voice raw gravel. "I just need a minute to stand." The bounty poster flapped behind them in the wind. Rosie's breath caught. Tobias Crane, hunted by an entire town, was swaying in front of her, bleeding onto the snow like ink. For a heartbeat, the world chose a side, her side. "If you want to live," she whispered, stepping into his shadow as the sheriff's men spilled from the saloon, "give me your weight and walk." She hooked his arm across her shoulders. He was fire and winter all at once, heat pouring through a body gone cold. They moved together, one staggering animal, deeper into the narrow cut of darkness. "Don't look back," she said. He didn't. Neither did she. The wind bit like teeth as Rosie dragged the stranger through the maze of back alleys behind the livery. Each step left a red print in the snow. Tobias was half-conscious, mumbling names she didn't recognize. Sarah, Emma, words broken by pain. His breath was shallow, his weight heavy as judgment. "Just a little farther," she whispered, though she had no idea where farther was. Behind them, the shouts of men faded toward the main road. The sheriff's posse was moving north toward Willow Pass, the wrong direction. For now, Rosie spotted an old smokehouse leaning against the butcher's yard, the roof caved, the door hanging loose. She wrestled him inside and eased him down onto a pile of burlap sacks. The smell of old meat made her stomach turn, but at least it was shelter. Tobias groaned as she pressed her hands against his shoulder. Warm blood soaked her fingers. The bullet had gone clean through, but infection was already working on him. "I need to stop the bleeding," she murmured, tearing the hem of her dress into strips. "Stay awake, all right?" He didn't answer. His head lolled to one side, eyes half open. Rosie worked fast. She'd watched her grandmother tend hunters' wounds back in Illinois, and her hands remembered what her mind didn't have time to question. She heated the knife over a stub of candle, cleaned it in the snow, and dug out a shard of lead the size of a pea. Tobias didn't flinch. That frightened her more than if he'd screamed. When she finished wrapping the shoulder, she sat back on her heels, shaking. The candle guttered, throwing shadows across his face. The wanted man from the poster was right in front of her. Not a monster, not a killer. Just a man with too many scars and nowhere left to go. "What have they done to you?" she whispered. He stirred, eyes opening to slits of blue. "Why, help me?" His voice was barely there, the words cracked with thirst. "You don't even know who I am." "I don't need to," she said simply. "I just know what it's like when no one cares whether you live or die." A flicker of something, surprise maybe, crossed his face. Then pain swallowed it whole, and he drifted back into fevered sleep. By dawn, the town's bells tolled again. Tobias slept, delirious. Rosie slipped outside, pulling her shawl tight. The sky was iron gray, the streets still crusted with snow. She had to find food, water, and medicine before the posse returned. But first, she needed to understand who she was helping. At the post office window, the latest reward notice fluttered under glass. Tobias Crane, wanted for murder and rape, $2,000 reward, dead or alive. $2,000, enough to feed her entire family for 2 winters, enough to start over. She stared at the poster for a long moment. Then she tore it down, folded it, and tucked it inside her coat. When she returned, Tobias was awake, sitting against the wall, breathing hard. He looked even bigger in daylight, his hair tangled, his beard unkempt. His shirt was soaked through, but his eyes were sharp now, no longer dazed. "Where are we?" he asked. "Old smokehouse, behind the butcher's." "Why?" "Because you were bleeding to death," Rosie said, setting down a tin of water. "You should drink." He took it, studying her as he drank. "You know what I am?" "A man with a wound," she said. He gave a humorless laugh. "That's not what the law calls me." "I saw the poster." "Then why didn't you collect it?" Rosie hesitated. "Because I don't believe what ink says about people. I've had enough of that myself." His gaze softened just a little. "What's your name?" "Rosie Palmer." "Where were you going, Rosie Palmer, before you decided to ruin your life for a stranger?" She smiled faintly, though her heart hurt. to marry a man who didn't want me. He sent me back on the train before I even arrived." He looked at her, truly looked, at the torn dress, the swollen feet, the dirt on her face. "So the world threw us both away." "I guess it did," she said quietly, "but maybe that means we get to start over." For a moment, silence filled the smokehouse. Not empty silence, but something fragile and alive. Tobias stared at the floor, jaw tightening. "Rosie," he said at last, "if anyone finds me, they'll hang me before sunset. If you stay, they'll hang you too." She met his eyes without flinching. "Then I suppose we'd better make sure no one finds you." Tobias blinked, as if the words confused him. No one had stood with him since the night everything burned, and in that instant, amid the stink of old smoke and fear, something shifted. A hunted man found faith again in the shape of a girl no one else had wanted, and a discarded bride found purpose in saving the only soul the world had condemned. Outside, the bells stopped ringing. Snow began to fall again, soft and slow, covering every trail but theirs. By the second sunset, the search parties had spread across the valley like wolves on a scent. Every tavern door carried his poster. Every rifleman in Blackwater wanted his blood. Tobias knew he couldn't stay near town another night. He needed height, stone, trees, and snow to hide him. "Can you walk?" Rosie asked, wrapping bread crusts and jerky into a kerchief. Far enough. He pushed to his feet, grimacing as his shoulder reopened. "But you should go south. There's safety in Helena. You'll freeze up here." "I'm not leaving you," she said, pulling her shawl tighter. "Not until you can stand without swaying." He looked down at her, this stubborn girl who barely reached his chest, and felt the first faint stir of something that wasn't rage. "You don't even know where I'm going." "Then I'll follow," she said. "That's what people do when they mean it." They left the smokehouse before dawn, moving along the creek that wound north into the timberline. Tobias's limp slowed them, but Rosie never complained. She carried what little food they had, offering him the larger share. He refused each time. "I can live off air," he muttered. "You've done enough living off air," she replied. "Eat before I force it down your throat." He almost smiled at that. Almost. When the trail turned to shale and ice, she slipped twice. Tobias caught her both times, his big hands closing around her wrists like iron. Each time he touched her, something sparked, a strange awareness neither of them named. By midday, they reached the foothills. Tobias led her to a hidden path barely wider than a deer track. "Hunters never come this way," he said. "Too steep?" "That's why we will," Rosie answered, voice trembling from cold but steady with resolve. Snow began to fall thicker now, erasing the world below. The forest muffled every sound but their breaths. Tobias's lungs burned, but he pressed on. For years he had moved only to survive. Now, for the first time, he was moving for someone else. The cabin came into view at dusk, a small structure of rough pine logs half buried beneath snowdrifts. Smoke curled faintly from the stone chimney. "You have a home?" Rosie gasped, surprised. "Had," Tobias corrected. "Left it after the fire. Couldn't stand the walls." He shouldered the door open. Inside, the air smelled of dust and ash, but the hearth stood ready with a half-stack of wood. Tobias struck flint, coaxing a flame to life. When the fire caught, he sank to the floor, exhausted. Rosie knelt beside him, rubbing her numb hands. The orange light softened everything. The hard planes of his face, the scars along his neck, the fear in her own heart. "This place is safe?" she asked. "Safe enough," he said. "No one comes up this far in winter." She set about heating water, her movements practical and careful. Tobias watched her unpack the meager food, watched her fingers, red from cold, tear bread into pieces for the pot. She worked like someone who had always cared for others, though no one had ever cared for her. When she offered him the first bowl, he shook his head. "You eat?" "Half," she insisted. "We share." He hesitated, then took it. The broth tasted of little more than salt and ashes, but it was the first warm thing he'd swallowed in weeks. They ate in silence until Tobias spoke again. "You don't ask questions." "I'll ask when you're ready to answer." His throat tightened. No one had given him that choice before. That night, the storm grew worse. Wind howled against the shutters like angry ghosts. Tobias lay awake on the floor, listening to it. Across the room, Rosie slept curled under his old buffalo hide, face turned toward the fire. Her breathing was steady, her lips slightly parted. He should have moved away, should have reminded himself she was just a girl who didn't know what she was risking. But something inside him refused to turn cold again. When she stirred, muttering in her sleep, he found himself saying softly, "You're safe here." She murmured, half dreaming, "So are you." Tobias closed his eyes. It was the first time in months that those words didn't sound like a lie. Days passed. Tobias's shoulder began to heal, though the limp in his leg lingered. He spent daylight hours mending traps and clearing paths around the cabin. Rosie cooked what little they had. Rabbit stew one day, wild onions and roots the next. At night, they talked. She told him about Illinois, the crowded kitchen where she'd kneaded bread for 9 mouths, the smell of coal smoke in winter, the ache of being unwanted in her own home. He told her nothing at first. Then slowly he began to speak about Sarah's laughter, about Emma's curls, about the night fire swallowed everything. His voice cracked when he said their names, and Rosie reached across the table, resting her hand on his. "You didn't kill them," she said quietly. "You loved them. That's what matters." He wanted to argue, to remind her that love hadn't saved them, but when he looked into her eyes, steady, brown, unflinching, the words fell apart. "Maybe," he whispered, "maybe love just needed another chance." That evening, the storm cleared. The valley below lay white and clean, as if the world itself had been forgiven. Tobias stood in the doorway, the cold biting his lungs, and felt something new settle in his chest. Not peace, exactly, but the shape of it. Behind him, Rosie stirred the fire. "You should rest," she said softly. "Can't. Haven't earned it yet." She smiled. "Maybe rest isn't earned. Maybe it's given." He turned to her then, the girl who had risked everything for him, who had looked past his scars and seen a man still worth saving. And for the first time in 3 months, Tobias Crane allowed himself to breathe without guilt. The hunted wolf had found his den, and the girl no one wanted had found the one man who finally did. Winter on Blackwater Ridge didn't ease, it simply learned to whisper instead of scream. Snow still clung to the roof like white iron, but the days stretched longer, and the wind carried more scent of pine than death. The cabin, once a cold refuge, had begun to feel alive again. Smoke from the chimney, laughter faint as breath, two voices learning how to fill the silence. Rosie had taken over the small kitchen corner, organizing the shelves with the same quiet stubbornness she carried in everything. She baked bread from wild barley Tobias had stored in old sacks and boiled roots into soups that almost tasted like home. Tobias rebuilt the fence outside and set traps closer to the tree line so she wouldn't have to wander far. They worked side by side, rarely speaking, but their silence had changed. It was no longer fear, it was trust forming in the spaces between words. One morning, Tobias came back from checking traps, snow up to his knees, holding two rabbits by the ears. "You're bleeding again," Rosie said immediately, seeing the red stain along his sleeve. "It's nothing." He dropped the rabbits onto the table. "Snare wire bit me. Won't even scar." "Everything scars," she said, fetching the basin, "even if you pretend it doesn't." He wanted to argue, but she had that tone again, the one that turned simple words into truth. So he sat down and let her clean the wound. Her fingers were warm despite the cold. When she dabbed the cloth over his skin, he winced, not from pain, but from the strange tenderness of it. "You act like you don't need anyone," she murmured, "but if you didn't, you wouldn't still be here." He looked at her, really looked. The light from the window framed her face, softening the freckles on her cheeks, catching the gold in her brown hair. "You could have run," he said quietly. "You should have." Rosie smiled faintly. "You saved me first." Tobias frowned. "I did nothing but bleed." "You gave me a reason to keep walking," she said. "That's saving enough." He couldn't reply. The words lodged deep, in a place he thought long burned away. That night, the mountain wrapped itself in fog. The fire burned low, crackling softly. Tobias sat at the table, sharpening his knife, while Rosie hummed near the hearth, mending a torn coat. It was the same tune she'd sung the night he first woke from fever. A lullaby her grandmother taught her, she said, for lost souls. "Don't stop," he said when she paused. She looked up, surprised. "You like it? It keeps the ghosts quiet." She laughed low and sweet and went on humming. For a man who'd lived by the sound of wolves and gunfire, Tobias realized this was the first music that hadn't come from memory. When the coat was done, Rosie poured him a cup of tea. He took it, fingers brushing hers. Neither spoke, but both felt it, the quiet current, the heartbeat between touches. "You ever wonder," Rosie said softly, "why some people survive everything and others don't survive love?" Tobias stared into the cup. "Because love's the hardest thing to survive." "Do you regret it? Loving them?" He hesitated, the fire reflecting in his eyes. "No, I regret not dying with them." Rosie's breath caught. "Don't say that." "Why not?" he asked bitterly. "What's a man worth when the only good thing he had is gone?" "You think you're the only one who's lost something?" she said, voice trembling. "I lost everything, too. My family didn't die, they just sold me. Do you know what it's like to see your father take money from another man's hand and say, 'She's yours now'?" Her words cracked the air like breaking a glass. Tobias froze, watching the tears she tried to hide. "Rosie," he said quietly. She shook her head. "Don't. I'm fine. It's just, when you talk about giving up, I understand. Because I wanted to. I thought maybe if I disappeared, nobody would notice. But then I found you, and suddenly I had someone to fight for again." Tobias rose slowly and crossed the small room. He didn't touch her, not yet, just stood near enough that she could feel his warmth. "You shouldn't have to fight for me," he said. "I already did," she whispered, "and I'd do it again." The words hung between them, fragile and holy. In the days that followed, their rhythm deepened. Tobias showed her how to set traps, how to walk quiet on snow so it wouldn't sing underfoot. Rosie taught him how to make bread that didn't turn to stone, how to mend a shirt so the stitches wouldn't show. At night, they read from an old Bible Tobias had salvaged from his burned home. Neither was devout, but both found comfort in its cadences. One evening, she caught him staring at her hands. "You keep looking at them," she said, half smiling. "Why?" He leaned back, eyes thoughtful. "Because I can't figure out how something that's done so much work still looks gentle." Her cheeks flushed. "You've got a way with words when you want to." "I've had years of silence to practice," he said. Then, after a beat, "Rosie, I don't know how to be around someone who isn't afraid of me." "Then learn," she said softly, "with me." He stared at her for a long time before nodding once, as though sealing a vow. Later that night, when the wind howled again, Rosie woke to find Tobias kneeling by the window, rifle in hand, his body rigid. She sat up, alarmed. "What is it?" "Riders," he said, eyes fixed on the darkness. "Down by the pass. Too many for traders." "Are they looking for you?" "They're always looking for me." Her pulse quickened, but her voice stayed calm. "What do we do?" He glanced back, saw the fear she tried to hide, and something inside him broke. A vow to keep her untouched by his world, that was no longer possible. "We survive," he said simply, "like we always do." She came to stand beside him, wrapping her shawl around both their shoulders. "Then you're not alone this time." For a long moment, they watched the distant flicker of torches through the snow. He felt her hand slip into his, trembling but sure, and for the first time in years, Tobias Crane did not face the night alone. The mountain had given him back fire, breath, and now something even more dangerous, hope. The storm built again outside, rattling the shutters, but inside the light was steady, the fire, the woman, and the quiet promise between them. Tomorrow would bring men and guns, and the past he could no longer outrun. But tonight, for a few stolen hours, there was only this: two broken souls, warming each other back to life. They came at dusk, a ragged braid of torchlight slipping along the pass like fire on a fuse. Tobias counted silhouettes through the frost-laced window. 6 riders, maybe 7. One carried a pennant that snapped in the wind. Another wore a stovepipe hat. No sane mountain man would bring this high, which told him everything he needed to know. Town men, men paid to finish what a courtroom never started. Rosie set the kettle deeper into the coals, steady hands betraying the tremor in her breath. "How many?" "Enough," Tobias said. "They'll split at the boulder field and try to flank us. They'll think I'll run. I won't." "Then neither will I." He almost told her to hide under the root cellar hatch, the way you talked to a child when wolves were on the ridge. But she was not a child, and the set of her jaw warned him she'd rather stand in the doorway than cower where she couldn't see the sky. "They'll call out first," he said. "Men like that like to hear themselves talk before they shoot." He checked the rifle, then the second, and slid the Navy revolver into the small of his back. "If I say go, you go. The draw behind the smokehouse drops to the creek. It'll carry our tracks if the wind holds. Rosie crossed to him and touched the sling at his shoulder. You can lift the rifle. Can you lift the past? Not tonight, he said, but I can keep it from killing you. Snow began again, fine, stinging, endless. The torches bobbed closer, then stilled. A voice rolled up the slope, lacquered with authority and whiskey. Tobias Crane, the man called. By order of the county court, you're under arrest. Come out slow with hands high. No one needs to die in this pretty storm. Another voice laughed beneath it. Speak for yourself, Judge. Tobias's mouth flattened. Aldous Finn, he murmured. Circuit Judge, Vivian Blackwell's dinner guest whenever the oysters come in by rail. He lifted the latch and stepped onto the porch, snow hissing against his boots. Evening, Your Honor. The stovepipe hat dipped. Crane, you gave us a hard winter. That winter started in your parlor, Tobias said. Tell Vivian her lies won't walk on my neck. Vivian's not here, Finn said mildly. Just the law, and money for anyone tired of starving. Gunmetal clicked in the dark. Tobias kept his hands loose and wide. There's a woman inside. She isn't part of this. Let her ride out. That depends, Finn called, on whether she knows what you did and whether she's worth $2,000. 2,000 bought your tongue already, Tobias said. Don't spend it twice. Snow thickened, a blessed curtain. Tobias felt Rosie's presence at his back before he heard her step, and every instinct in him keened like a struck wire. He started to angle his body to cover hers, but she was already at the doorway, shawl thrown wide like a banner. I know what he did, she said, voice ringing into the trees. He bled, saving his wife. He's bled every day since. Laughter cut from the riders. Sweetheart, you don't know him. I know the men who say their law and do the work of a woman who pays them to lie, Rosie answered. Which one are you? The pause that followed was short, but it had weight. Tobias heard reins creak, the shuffle of a nervous gelding, the small betrayals of men who weren't sure which way the wind would blow this story once it reached town. He seized it. Judge, he said, send your worst shot to fetch the deputy with the birdshot scars on his left hand. Tell him Tobias Crane still remembers who pulled a boy out of the river in '74. Tell him if he wants to look me in the eye again, he can do it without a rope in his fist. Finn's voice cooled. You're cornered. We can talk all night or we can make it quick. Then make it honest, Rosie said, and stepped forward into the doorway light. Back, Tobias breathed. No, she whispered, and there was no tremor now. I have to show you something before the shooting starts. She reached beneath the binding of her dress and drew out a packet wrapped in oiled cloth, edges softened by months of hiding. Tobias stared, uncomprehending, as she unrolled it on the porch rail, a signed contract of sale, the ink browned by cold. But the signature at the bottom was not Horace Grimm's. It was Vivian Blackwell's clerk, witnessed by the judge's own seal. Rosie met his eyes. When my father sold me, the money didn't come from Grimm. It came through Blackwell's office as a finder's fee, routed via the court. They traffic in women the way they traffic in verdicts. I was paper in their hands. Her voice shook once, then steadied. I took this the day they threw me back on the train. I kept it because I thought someday I'd need proof that I wasn't nothing. Turns out it proves there's no law here but theirs. Tobias's breath left him like a fist to the ribs. Rosie, why didn't you? Because you were bleeding, she said simply, And because I knew if you saw one more thing you couldn't fix, you'd die standing up." She lifted the contract higher so the snow-smeared seal caught the torch glow. "Judge Finn, your seal's on this sale. You sign women like receipts, then call it justice. If you take Tobias tonight, I'll walk this paper to Helena when the pass opens. I'll read every word in front of the governor's clerk. I'll say your name slow." Silence dropped hot as a brand. Somewhere in the dark, a horse stamped and snorted. Finn's voice, when it came, wore velvet over wire. "You're bluffing, girl. You won't reach Helena." "I reached this mountain," she said. "I'll reach anything." The first shot snapped the air before he could move. Tobias grabbed Rosie and spun, the ball taking the door jamb where her head had been. Wood spat splinters. Fire leapt in his blood. He shoved her inside, slammed the bar down, and the night exploded, rifles cracking, snow smoldering around the porch posts where heat met ice. "Cellar!" he barked. She shook her head, already hauling the water bucket to the wall. "Smoke them blind first." He dragged the old mattress to the doorway while she doused it. When the next volley hit, Tobias kicked the flaming, sputtering bulk out onto the porch. Steam belched into the gun line, the torches blurring to orange smears. He dropped, rolled, and fired twice into the confusion, not to kill, though he could have, but to break the circle wide enough to run. "Now," he said, and they went, through the back, down the goat path he'd cut as a boy for a winter, dare his mother never discovered. Snow swallowed their boots to the shin. The creek below roared black beneath its sugar crust. He broke the edge with his heel and urged her into the numbing water. "Stay in the current, 10 paces, then out." They splashed, teeth clacking, hearts in their throats. Behind them, shouts frayed into argument. Someone had gone down in the steam. Someone else didn't want to die on a story that might turn. They crawled out beneath a thicket of alder. Tobias dragged fallen branches across their exit, then wrapped Rosie in his coat, swallowing his own shiver. "You all right?" She nodded, lips blue, eyes fierce. "We have to make the north saddle before they regroup." He stared at her, the ice in her hair, the bruised grace of her stubborn mouth, and understood that whatever he had thought of God since the fire had been a child's mistake. Mercy didn't come soft. Sometimes it came as a girl with a contract under her skin and a will like iron. They climbed. Wind knifed under their clothes. The slope tilted to broken rock that bit through leather soles. Twice he lifted her over ledges, hands burning, shoulders screaming where fever had once eaten bone. Each time she whispered, "Almost there," and he believed her because there was no other choice left in the world. At the north saddle, the storm dropped without warning, like a curtain ripped from a stage. For a moment, the whole valley opened, a white sea. Torches far below dwindled to sparks. On the far rim, a darker line moved against the drift. More riders, the East Trail. "They brought Pinkertons," Tobias said. "Vivian's money rides in black coats." "Then we don't go down," Rosie said. "We go up." "No one goes up in a whiteout." "We do." He wanted to argue. He couldn't. She'd been right at the door, at the creek, at the contract that would set half the county on fire once someone brave enough to read it aloud stood in a warm office with a pen. They angled toward the knife-back ridge where the spruces grew like prayers too stubborn to die. The air thinned. Snow turned to dust that scoured the face. At last, a shadow resolved in the drift, a granite shoulder curving into a cave so narrow a man had to turn sideways to enter. He pushed her through first, then followed. shoulders scraping stone. Inside, the air stilled. The mountain had a heart after all, and this was one of its quiet chambers. Rosie sank against the rock, shaking with cold and adrenaline. Tobias knelt before her, chafing her hands hard enough to hurt. "You held a fuse to a judge," he said. "You put your name against his." "I put our names on something that can't be burned," she said, "and I'm not done." He closed his eyes, then opened them to her face. "When this ends, if it ends, you don't owe me anything." She reached up and caught his shirt, pulling him close until he could feel the warmth returning to her breath. "Don't you dare try to set me free like I'm a problem to solve. I chose you. I'll choose you tomorrow." Below, the mountain coughed a distant echo, men shouting at wind, at one another, at a story they could no longer keep straight. Tobias rested his forehead against hers. "Then tomorrow," he said, "we take the next piece from them, their witness, their ledger, whatever it is. We put it in daylight." "We start with the deputy who owes a river," Rosie said, "and we keep walking until Helena." He almost laughed, a raw, astonished sound. "Helena's a long road." "So is this one," she whispered, "and look where it brought us." Outside, snow erased every footprint. Inside, two fugitives warmed stone with breath and hunger and the kind of promise people write into rings. The law would come again. The past would claw. But the mountain had chosen its weather, and it was theirs now. "Sleep," he said. "We can't." "Then close your eyes and think of light," he answered. "Because we're going to carry some down." She did. He kept watch with the rifle across his knees and her contract against his heart, listening as the storm finally turned from rage to lullaby. Dawn crawled slow over Blackwater Ridge, pale and cruel. The storm had cleared, but the sky stayed bruised. Down in the valley, the searchers had found the smoke and ruin of Tobias's cabin, burned to a black skeleton in the snow. Men pointed at boot prints, at the creek's broken crust, at trails that led north. The sheriff's deputies, the hired Pinkertons, the judge's men, they were all arguing about direction when a single rider appeared on the ridge above them. It was Rosie. Her shawl whipped like a flag in the wind. She sat straight in the saddle of Tobias's old mare, her face pale but fierce. When the first gun rose, she shouted, "Don't shoot! I've come to end this." The crowd went still. Behind her, hidden in the tree line, Tobias watched through the scope of his rifle, every muscle tight. He hadn't wanted this. He'd told her to wait in the cave, to let him draw them off. But Rosie had seen the truth last night. No running would ever clear his name. Only daylight could. She guided the horse down slowly. The men parted, muttering, unsure what kind of ghost they were seeing. Judge Finn stepped forward, his hat rimmed with frost. "Miss Palmer," he said, voice dripping with false courtesy, "you look far from your mountain. Where's Crane?" "Here," she said, pressing a hand to her heart. "And here." She reached into her coat and pulled out the packet of papers. "But if you mean his body, you'll have to earn it. I came with something better. The truth." Finn sneered. "You mean your little forgery? The one you waved last night before you ran into the snow like a mad woman?" "It's not forged," Rosie said. "It bears your seal." She opened the cloth and held up the contract high enough for everyone to see the wax stamp glinting red in the cold light. "You and Vivian Blackwell have been selling women through the county court. You turned the law into a brothel ledger." A low growl rippled through the crowd. men who'd never liked the Blackwells but feared them too much to speak. The sheriff's jaw clenched. "Judge, that true?" Finn's hand went to his coat. "She's lying," he snapped. "Crane put her up to it." That was when Tobias stepped out of the trees. He moved slow, rifle low but ready. His coat was torn, beard rimed with frost, eyes sharp as steel. The crowd drew back instinctively. "She's not lying," he said, "and I've got proof enough to hang you twice." Finn's pistol cleared leather, but Tobias was faster, not by much, just enough. His bullet struck the snow at the judge's feet, close enough to make him drop the gun. "Next one," Tobias said, voice low. "Won't miss." The sheriff raised both hands. "Hold it right there, Crane. You're still wanted for murder." Rosie swung from the saddle, landing hard in the snow. He was wanted for a lie. Now you've got witnesses to the truth. She pointed at Marcus Webb, the merchant who'd come forward weeks ago, but never spoken. He stood pale and sweating in the crowd, caught by her stare. "Tell them," she said. "Tell them what you saw." Webb swallowed. "I saw Aldrich Blackwell force his way into the Crane cabin that night. Tobias only fought him off. It was self-defense." The crowd erupted, half shouting, half stunned. The sheriff looked from Webb to the papers, to Rosie's trembling hands. The noose of rumor that had followed Tobias for months began to fray. Judge Finn, realizing the tide was turning, lunged for his pistol again, but Rosie was already between him and Tobias. The shot cracked the air. For a moment, no one breathed. Then Tobias saw her fall. He caught her before she hit the ground, blood blooming through her shawl. "No, Rosie, stay with me, do you hear me?" His voice broke, the kind of sound that could drag mercy from God himself. Rosie's eyes fluttered open. "You said daylight," she whispered. "Now they see it." Behind them, the sheriff's gun fired. Finn dropped face first into the snow, his corruption spilling red over white. The crowd closed in, not as a mob this time, but as witnesses. No one looked away. Tobias held Rosie, rocking her as snow began to fall again, soft as ash. "Stay, please," he murmured. "You can't leave me now." Her hand brushed his cheek. "I'm not leaving," she breathed. "You'll carry me wherever you go." Then her eyes went still, half open, reflecting the rising sun over the ridge. Tobias bowed his head to her forehead, lips trembling. "You did it," he whispered. "You won." The sheriff cleared his throat. "Crane," he said quietly, "you're a free man now." Tobias looked up, eyes hollow. "Then God help me, because I don't know what to do with freedom." He rose, cradling Rosie in his arms, her hair spilling over his sleeve. The snowlight turned her face pale gold, a saint carved from frost and fire. "Bury her on the ridge," he said softly, "where the light hits first." And when the men stepped aside, Tobias Crane walked through them like a storm finally spent. A man once hunted by the world, now carrying the only reason he'd ever wanted to live. The funeral was held on a wind-still morning. The mountain had laid down its fury. Only the hush of melting snow answered the preacher's words. Tobias dug the grave himself, though men from town had offered. He would let no one else touch the earth that would cradle Rosie Palmer. He worked until his palm split, until the shovel struck frozen stone. When at last he lowered her into the hollow, he wrapped her shawl around her one final time, the same one that had waved against dawn and stopped a bullet. He placed the contract beside her chest, folded neat. Proof, she had called it. To him, it was scripture. "Sleep easy," he murmured. "You gave truth to a man who thought he was finished with it." The sheriff stood back with his hat in his hands. Around them, townsfolk who once whispered murderer now whispered prayers. Even Marcus Webb wept openly, voice shaking as he promised to testify before the governor. The town that had hunted Tobias had come to mourn beside him. When the last clod of earth fell, Tobias knelt and pressed his hand to the mound. Snowflakes melted against his skin, tiny sparks fading to water. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the weight of guilt, but the ache of gratitude. That night, he returned alone to what was left of his cabin. Smoke still curled from the blackened beams. He rebuilt the fire pit stone by stone, not to warm himself, but to keep the promise she'd made him keep. Carry the light down. Weeks passed. Tobias worked silently with the sheriff and the governor's men to expose the Blackwell ring. Testimonies rolled in. Clerks, drivers, even the deputy with the scarred hand. The court in Helena cleared Tobias Crane of all charges. Judge Finn's estate was seized. Vivian Blackwell was sentenced to hang. When the verdict was read, Tobias didn't smile. Justice was never joy. It was simply breath returning to lungs long starved of it. He left town the next day before dawn, climbing the ridge with a small wooden box under his arm. Inside was Rosie's shawl, faded and frayed, and a sprig of mountain heather she once tucked behind her ear. He built a cairn above her grave, stacking stones until the wind hummed through them like a low hymn. "I brought you back what you gave me," he said quietly, light enough to see the way down. He stood there until the first gold spilled over the valley, washing the world clean. Somewhere below, a child laughed, a sound sharp and bright as the bells of spring. Tobias closed his eyes and breathed. For the first time, it didn't hurt to remember. When he opened them, a hawk wheeled through the morning air, rising from the trees near her grave. It cut across the sun, a dark wing in a sea of flame, then vanished into the blue. Tobias smiled. "I see you," he whispered. "Keep watch." Then he turned toward the valley, toward the life she had bought for him with her courage, and began the long walk home. Every time the wind crosses Blackwater Ridge, it carries her story. The girl who was called too plain, too soft, too fat to matter, yet stood between a hunted man and the hangman's rope. Rosie Palmer proved that love isn't found in beauty or comfort, but in the courage to believe in someone when the world calls them beyond saving. Tobias Crane lived because she refused to stop believing. Wherever you're listening from tonight, remember her name and remember this. Sometimes the bravest hearts beat in the quietest souls. Do you still believe in that kind of love?